My humble pranams and a very happy afternoon to one and all present here. On behalf of IHMA Chennai chapter, myself, Dr. D. Sneha, take immense pleasure in welcoming back you all to the Lockdown Learning webinar series. I welcome all our senior doctors, National Working Committee members of IHMA, and all the state and district members of IHMA. We have been attending Lockdown Learning webinar series since May 2021, conducted by IHMA Chennai chapter, and today is the last session of our rich learning webinar series. Before starting our session, let us all remember and thank our master, Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, for giving us this wonderful system of medicine in serving mankind. Without any further delay, let's get into our rocking final session by our beloved Dr. Anantharaman sir on an attempt to understand the pathophysiology of homeopathic materia medica. Sir is a consultant at Arudra Homeopathic Clinic in Nanganallur and Ashok Nagar. He has a rich clinical experience of about 2 decades. He was graduated from Father Muller's Homeopathic Medical College, Mangalore. He has acquired twin master degree in psychology and counseling and psychotherapy to equip himself as a consummate homeopath, adept in treating all physical, mental, and psychological illnesses that confront a patient. He is holding stellar positions as National Working Committee member of IHMA. He is also a member of Dr. Kopikas Foundation for Homeopathy. He is a multifaceted homeopathic consultant of repute with his wide repertoire of clinical acumen. He has presented many scientific papers at seminars and has delivered his rich clinical knowledge at many seminars and webinars. He has been mentoring many young budding homeopaths for decades with a spectacular knowledge on homeopathy and clinical practice. We welcome you, sir. A kind request to the participants. Please post your queries in the chat box, which will be answered by our honorable speakers at the end of the session. Now, I humbly request Dr. Anantharaman sir to commence the session. Sir, please.
Good afternoon, dear doctors. I'm very happy to be amongst you all again to share some of my learnings related to the understanding of pathophysiology of homeopathic medicines. Homeopathic medicines, I usually say, they are ultra scientific. They are the most scientific medicine that can be found in the planet right now. It's neo-modern. It's the science behind homeopathy is so great that every day when I try to learn something new, I'm enthralled by the science behind homeopathic literature. Whatever may be the symptoms that are described in the homeopathic material, each and every symptom has a lot of pathophysiology behind it. Only if we learn a little bit about the pathophysiology of homeopathic medicines, our usage of homeopathic medicines will be further extended. Certain pathophysiologies are clearly visible to us just by reading certain symptoms. But certain other symptoms, the pathophysiology is not direct. It's a bit hidden, and we need to dig a bit deep and decode these symptoms to understand the homeopathic pathophysiology of these medicines. Once understood, we'll be astonished that we have not been using this medicine to its right potential. Many of the medicines, we use it for certain conditions, but the real usage lies even more in a bigger plane. So today, it's a small attempt by me to understand the pathophysiology of 2 medicines, because I don't want to post a lot of medicines. I thought it'll be better if we can learn 2 medicines in depth. So this is a small attempt to try to understand the pathophysiology of 2 medicines. I hope you'll appreciate and understand the pathophysiology behind these medicines. And I'm always welcome to your criticisms and updates so that I can make it even more better the next time. So without wasting much time, we'll go directly into the session. Before that, I'd like to thank IHMA for such a great series of webinars. I thank all the senior members of NWC, of IHMA, the Chennai chapter, and all those people behind this wonderful webinar series. I hope it was a great learning session till now. And I think this session also will do some justice to whatever sessions happened before. Yeah. Shall we go right into the session, please? Am I audible clearly?
Yes, sir. You are clearly audible, sir.
Thank you. Dr. Akshay, can you please help me in sharing the session, please?
Sure.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll go to the next slide, please. Right. We are going to see about Ipecac, one of the very commonly used medicines in our clinical setup. We use this medicine for many, many varied conditions, be it some gastrointestinal, or predominantly we use it for a lot of respiratory conditions. We use Ipecac for a lot, but the main symptom which we use Ipecac for is a continuous nausea, not better by vomiting. This is the hallmark symptom of Ipecac, which we keep as a striking symptom of Ipecac. If you are going to use Ipecac, this is the symptom which we generally expect, a continuous nausea, not better by vomiting. And we all say that Ipecac closely runs along with Antimtat. But you'll be astonished to learn the pathophysiological states of Ipecac and Antimtat. They're very close running. Whatever homeopathic Medica says, actually the pathophysiological states of Ipecac and Antimtat also runs very closely. Right. To say like continuous nausea, not better by vomiting. Generally, for what we have vomiting? Vomiting is also an adaptive state of the body, like your cough reflex or a sneezing reflex. Vomiting is also an adaptive reflex by your body. Our body tries to compensate certain things. Primarily, any upper GI irritation or an obstruction, be it gastritis or erosion or a obstruction or a stenosis or a tumor or an intestinal obstruction in the upper GI. All these things, you get a vomiting, gastroenteritis or something like whenever there is an irritation in the upper GI, you get a vomiting. And vomiting is mainly caused because body tries to relieve the upper GI of these irritants. So vomiting per se is a adaptive response of our body. And once you vomit these irritants, you get better until again you get the irritants again, either through eating or some other process where these irritants again are present in the upper GI. So till then you will not have vomiting. You get you vomit, you feel relieved, and after some time you again have this sensation of vomiting. But here we have something called a continuous nausea, not better by vomiting. Generally, all gastrointestinal, at least the upper GI irritants, once they vomit, they feel better. But let us try to see what are the other reasons for vomiting. It can be a pain, it can be unpleasant smell or a taste or an event. It can be any anxiety, any sight or a thought of some unpleasant event. Also, any sensation of imbalance, any disturbance in the electrolytes, be it potassium or a sodium or a calcium or certain other things like an oxygen, a hypoxia can trigger vomiting, an increased carbon dioxide or a hypercapnia can initiate vomiting, a low pH and acidosis can initiate vomiting. How does this happen? No, we have, like it's an autonomic process. It's an automatic process. It's not under our control. It's an autonomic process. So this vomiting center, as you all know, many of these autonomic functions, they have the centers in the middle on the pons. So we have our vomiting center, the neurons collected as a nuclei present in the medulla, which actually triggers this vomiting. So under the influence of this medullary vomiting center, when those impulses are stimulated through the autonomic nervous system, the impulses are given to the gastrointestinal tract, especially the upper GI, and it ends up in vomiting. So this vomiting center, from where it gets these impulses? It gets from a small center, just adjacent to the vomiting center in the medulla oblongata. It's called chemoreceptor trigger zone. So any chemical change, be it some drugs and opioids or anesthetics or any other endogenous toxins or anything like a low oxygen level, a high carbon dioxide level. Like actually, we have some sensory receptors in the inner wall of the arteries near the arch of aorta, which is called an aortic body, and a group of neurons acting as a sensor in the bifurcation of carotid arteries into an internal and external carotid arteries. There you have a collection of certain neurons which act as a receptor, acts as a sensor. It receives, like these two bodies, aortic body and the carotid body, whenever the blood passes through it, it either senses the chemical nature of the blood or the pressure. It can be a chemoreceptor or a baroreceptor. Any change in the normal chemical constituents of the blood, that actually triggers a sensory impulse. So this aortic body and the carotid body through glossopharyngeal nerve and vagus nerve goes into the chemoreceptor zone. It gives the impulses. If at all there is any change, it gives us impulses to the chemoreceptor zone. And once the chemoreceptor trigger zone receives the impulses, it takes an appropriate action. It gives this to the vomiting center, the impulse to the vomiting center, and vomiting center stimulates vomiting. We'll see why this vomiting happens later on. Fine. One is this chemoreceptor trigger zone. The other can be the higher centers, the cerebral cortex. Any pain or any smell, any unpleasant sight, unpleasant thought, any anxieties, or any displeasures can also stimulate your vomiting center. Similarly, your vestibular nuclei, mainly the inner ear, which controls your or which gives the impulses about the balance, the auditory impulses, the auditory vestibular cochlear nerve. It gives the vestibular apparatus and the sensory impulses to the cerebellar cortex. So if there is any disturbance in the imbalance part of it, if there is any imbalance, the vestibular nuclei sends appropriate signals to the vomiting center and it ends up in vomiting, because all these things are adaptive measures of our body, and other things like any irritants in the pharynx or the GIT, that also gives impulse to the vomiting center and that also causes vomiting. So there are plethora of reasons for vomiting. But generally, vomiting happens like in many things. Like actually, there is one other condition called acidosis. It can be a metabolic acidosis or a respiratory acidosis. In this acidosis, you get a lot of vomiting. Why do you get a lot of vomiting? Because in case of acidosis, the acid content of the body is more. The alkali part of it is low. So the pH always comes down. So our body cannot stay in a low pH. It has to be somewhere between 7.35 and 7.45. So it always try to come back to the normal pH where our body can function in the optimum level. So if at all there is an acidosis, it can be a respiratory or metabolic acidosis. If there is a low pH, our body initially tries to compensate it somehow. Our gastric content has lots of hydrogen ions, the protons. The hydrogen ions that are got from the gastric acid secreting cells into the lumen of the stomach are very important in maintaining the pH. So whenever there is an acidosis, our body tries to get rid of these protons, because when protons are lost, naturally, for at least for some time, the pH can come back to its normal condition. Till the real cause of acidosis is taken care of, there's a first response by our body to get rid of this hydrogen proton ions, because hydrogen is the main indicator of your pH. It is the main contributor for the pH. So any acidosis, body throws up all the contents from the stomach. So from along with the contents, a lot of protons also are lost, and body tries to come back somewhere near the normal pH. But this is only a first response by our body. Like any danger situation in our body, our sympathetic nervous system stimulates certain defense mechanisms. One of the defense mechanism in acidosis is vomiting. Though we think it is a clinical symptom, our body tries to compensate ourselves. So this vomiting in acidosis is a compensatory mechanism by our body trying to get rid of this hydrogen ions, at least for some time, till it is again secreted, so that pH can be in an optimum level. So problem is that, like in ipecac, and here actually this nausea not better by vomit. If it is for any other reason, once you vomit, the chance of you having the sensation to vomit and again is less, unless the irritation is so high. But clinically, there is a condition where the person will not feel better even after vomiting. Even after the vomiting, even after the gastric contents are thrown out, no more irritations are there. Still, that person will have that constant nausea and vomiting. Fine. I understand there are certain painful conditions. Uremia. Fine. Uremia leads to acidosis, like uremia, and certain, like it can be a hepatic encephalopathy. These conditions have a continuous vomiting, because there is always an acidosis. Because of this acidosis, always body tries to get rid of this hydrogen ions. So whenever you have a continuous nausea, not better by vomiting, you can think it can be an indication of an underlying acidosis. It can be a metabolic acidosis or a respiratory acidosis. Fine. In ipecac, it has action on both respiratory and metabolic acidosis, but metabolic acidosis part of it, we are not going to concentrate today because it's not in our today's context of discussion. So ipecac has a very good role in respiratory acidosis. Fine, we'll try to learn how it happens. So, ipecac is a very good medicine for any lower respiratory affection. It can be any bronchitis or a bronchial asthma or a bronchiolitis, emphysema, anything. So, dyspnea plays a very important role in ipecac symptomatology. So this patient presents with a lot of disturbance in breathing. What happens is that during any inflammation or an allergy where there is a smooth muscle contraction along with a lot of mucus secretion, it tries to reduce the lumen. What happens is that because of this inflammatory nature, the lumen of the airway becomes very narrowed. Because of the narrowed air passage, air entry and air exit from the air passage gets limited. Because of this, the oxygen entering into the body for gases exchange gets reduced, or the ventilation part of it gets reduced. So there is not much amount of oxygen to exchange in the respiratory membrane to the pulmonary capillaries. So it leads to a low oxygen state. It's called a hypoxia. It's called a hypoxic hypoxia. Whenever hypoxia can be of many types, I think we have already discussed. Hypoxia can be a hypoxic hypoxia, or an ischemic hypoxia, or an anemic hypoxia, or even a tissue-based hypoxia. So this hypoxic hypoxia means whenever there is a low oxygen content in the blood, mainly because there is not much of an air that can enter into the body because of some respiratory tract narrowing, whatever may be the reason. So because of this hypoxic hypoxia, oxygen level comes down. At the same time, body is not able to get rid of this carbon dioxide also outside because of the spasm and narrowing of the respiratory tract. So because of this, whenever there is a low oxygen count and increased carbon dioxide, carbon dioxide, whenever it is there in the blood, it joins with water to form something called a carbonic acid. So whenever there is more amount of carbon dioxide, a lot of carbonic acid is formed, and it leads to decreased pH. Because the proton part of it, the acid part of it is more, the pH comes down. It's called a acidosis. Because it is an acidosis mainly because of the respiratory part of it. There is no metabolic cause. It's only the respiratory cause. It's called a respiratory acidosis. And whenever there is a respiratory acidosis, our body tries to compensate it. It's a dangerous situation. Our sympathetic stimulation immediately responds and causes a vomiting because it tries to get rid of the protons or the hydrogen ions in the upper GA. So by doing this, at least some amount of acidosis will be reduced. The pH can come somewhere near the 7.35 range, which is the basic necessity for a pH. 7.35 to 7.45 is the normal range. So if it is going less than 7.35, lot of normal activities in our body will be hampered. So our body tries to get rid of the protons initially. That is one of the defense mechanisms of our body, and that leads to vomiting. And for some time, the respiratory acidosis slightly compensated. Next slide, please. Right. So here, fine. Please do bear with me. Like, it is not a lot of pathology alone, because on learning this pathology, it will become very easy to understand the symptomatology and pathology of the medicine HIPCAC, right? So for any acidosis, there are 5 criteria that has to be seen: pH, PO2, PCO2, bicarbonate ions, and SpO2. Out of this, SpO2 is not much important. Mainly you have pH, PCO2, and bicarbonate. Normal pH in our body is 7.35 to 7.45. We will not concentrate much on PO2 and SpO2. We'll concentrate only on these 3 things. PCO2 normally is between 35 and 45. It's easy to remember. pH is 7.35 to 7.45. PCO2 is 35 to 45. Just take off the 7. Bicarbonate is somewhere around 22 to 26. So whenever PCO2 increases more than 45, it becomes 46, 47, 48, pH reduces. Whenever PCO2 increases, pH reduces. It's indirectly proportional. And bicarbonate, whenever it increases, pH also increases. Because it is an alkali, it causes alkalosis. So they are directly proportional. Bicarbonate, when it increases, pH also increases. Fine. In this example, we have something, the acute part of it. There, the pH is 7.3. And you'll understand it is a low pH. because 7.35 is the normal one. 7.3 is less than the bare minimum of the pH that is needed. Here PO2 is less. 65 is a moderate hypoxia. So there is not much of oxygen in the blood. But more importantly, PCO2 is more. It is 47. So you'll understand PCO2 is high. So automatically pH will be less. This is a typical case of respiratory acidosis. And if you see bicarbonate, it is between 22 and 26. Like usually it happens. Now here actually the body tries to compensate in certain conditions. We'll see in the next one. Here pH is low, PCO2 is high. It is a typical case of acute respiratory acidosis. Suppose if this respiratory acidosis is going to happen for some more time, it is going to take a slow period of time, a long period of time to develop acidosis, our body tries to compensate it. Suppose it happens within half an hour, you don't have any time to compensate it. But if you get this problem in a matter of 3 to 4 weeks or a week, our body tries to compensate. Like suppose a person with the COPD, he will have low PO2, but his body will compensate it. He will not go in for a frank respiratory acidosis every time. But whereas if you get an acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS, you don't have much of time for the body to compensate. So if you see certain conditions, chronic conditions or subacute conditions, body tries to compensate it. In this, actually, if you see, it is 7.34. It is somewhere near normal. Here also PO2 is less. PCO2 is same 47. But here the pH is somewhere near normal. We see the bicarbonate ion has increased 26 plus. Things that our body tries to restrict the amount of bicarbonate that is going through the kidneys into the urine. It tries to reduce the amount of bicarbonate going into the urine so that if alkali is increased, acid is increased, alkali also is increased, and your pH also will come back somewhere to normal. This is called a compensated respiratory acidosis. But this compensated respiratory acidosis you'll see only in chronic conditions like COPD or emphysema or chronic bronchitis, any chronic condition where it takes a long time to develop an acidosis. You have time for the body to compensate it. But certain acute conditions like a pneumonia, like a bronchiolitis, like a severe asthma, like a acute exacerbation of chronic bronchitis or an emphysema or acute respiratory distress syndrome, like what we see in COVID, you will not have much of a time for the body to compensate it. Kidneys will not have enough time to restrict the amount of bicarbonate going in the urine because it happens within half an hour or 1 hour. So kidney can compensate it if it is given some time. But if it is not given some time, it will not compensate. So this is an uncompensated acute respiratory acidosis. Next, please. Fine. This is where is your epicat stage. Fine. Whenever there is an acute uncompensated respiratory acidosis, you will get this symptom of a continuous nausea, not better by vomiting, because the body has not much of time for the kidney to restrict the amount of bicarbonate that is going into the urine. So it can't increase bicarbonate within short time, but it tries to get rid of these protons, hydrogen ions in the body. So at least by it, it can try to bring back the pH to somewhere close to the normal thing. So it vomits. So whenever you vomit, all your gastric contents along with your hydrogen ions are lost. So whenever hydrogen ions are lost, pH tries slightly to improve. But thing is that actually in this acute stage, the hypoxia and hypercapnia will not be relieved so fast unless you take some very good measures to relieve the hypoxia and hypercapnia by either bronchodilating or any other way, or giving appropriate medicines to them, homeopathic medicines to them, till the point where the acute hypoxia and hypercapnia is not relieved. This respiratory acidosis will continue. So when respiratory acidosis will continue, there is not much time for the kidney to compensate. The only compensation that is expected is only vomiting. So you keep on vomiting. When you vomit, you lose a lot of acids, lot of protons, so that it will not allow the pH to go very low. Even if it is not coming back to normalcy, you will try to make sure that it is not going very low, right? So this is your epic state. Fine. I just wanted to uh, emphasize on this part because Ipecac is not a medicine just for a chronic bronchitis or emphysema or a acute asthma. It's not as simple like if it is an acute asthma, like that's what homeopathy also says. It's not the diagnosis which we are going to treat. You are going to treat the patient in the diagnosis because which pathological state he is in. Even in asthma, there are many stages. So each particular stage will throw off a particular set of symptoms. And we all know only on the based on the totality of the symptom, we give the medicine. It actually means we give medicines only for the pathological states in which the patients are there. It can be an asthma, but some people will be in a particular pathological state. They may require Ipecac, but some people will not be in the state of uh, Ipecac. If they are not in the pathological state of Ipecac, they will not give those symptoms, and Ipecac will not be relieved. Even if you give Ipecac, it will not help. Suppose the same patient, if is having asthma, his hypoxia is not so low and hypercapnia is not so high, meaning the pH is not come down, he will not present with this nausea, not backed by continuous vomiting. And even if he give Ipecac in this stage, it may not help. So only on the, like actually that's what like homeopathy says, if we have the symptoms, this medicine will act. If you don't have the symptom, it will not work. Similarly, it actually it's a different way of saying it. If you are in that particular pathological state, it will work. If you are not in that particular pathological state, how much ever of repetition of this medicine will not help. Fine. Uh, in this new era of science, actually homeopathic medicines run very much parallel with the latest scientific developments. Homeopathic medicines are so flexible, or it must be so advanced. Maybe science is catching up a little bit. Like actually 2 years, 200 years before, people are not very aware of this respiratory acidosis, type 1 respiratory failure, type 2 respiratory failure, and all. But on seeing a particular set of symptoms, they used to give medicines. But now we have come a long way ahead. We have a lot of developments in the scientific field. Let us actually correlate our medicines in the present day scientific atmosphere. And if you are going to talk in the line of present day scientific language, our medicines will be understood even more better, and there will be more positive attitude towards homeopathic medicines because this is what people expect. We need to talk about homeopathic medicines in the present day scientific language. Fine. Coming back to respiratory acidosis, in the respiratory acidosis also, I said like pathological states, like even respiratory acidosis, you have two set of pathological states. You'll be knowing like a person with continuous vomiting and diarrhea, gastroenteritis, it can go in for a dehydration. And dehydration initially, the person will be very irritable. He'll be very irritable and he'll ask for water to drink. I had a patient some 7, 8 years back. Parents came with a second child to me and said he's having a lot of diarrhea and vomiting and he wanted some medicine. When I was just asking about the patient's symptoms, they started crying and they said, yesterday we lost our first son because he also got gastroenteritis, he had dehydration and they didn't know. Like someone in the family or the neighbors told that you must not give water unless that person asks for water. So they never gave him water. Initially, dehydration, initially they'll be irritable and active. They'll crave for water. They'll ask for water. But if you are going to the later stage of dehydration, that irritability will go off. They'll become very drowsy. They'll not ask even for water. And this first son of this patient had gone to the deep dehydration. He never asked for water because he was so drowsy. He didn't have even that energy to ask for water. And because someone instructed them not to give water, they also didn't give water. Next day, in the afternoon, they saw this person was dead, even without their knowledge that uh, child died actually, and they felt really bad. And the second child was in the early part of dehydration. He had irritability. He asked for water. So when he asked for water, they gave him water, and his dehydration was not progressive, and luckily he survived. Similarly, in respiratory acidosis also, the early part of respiratory acidosis, our body has energy to respond. If you see a person in respiratory acidosis in the early stage, he'll be very irritable, very anxious, very restless, and very irritable. He'll not have any drowsiness, and he'll be very much oriented. He'll be knowing what is happening to him. Though he's anxious, he'll know what is happening to him. And if respiratory acidosis goes in the later stage, if it is going to progress, if you're not going to give any appropriate remedies or supportive measures, the acidosis can go even more, like uncompensated acute respiratory failure can further go. pH can go less than 7.3, 7.27. When it goes deep down, this person will still vomit. He'll still vomit because acidosis, our body tries to get relieved of the protons. He continues to vomit, but he goes in for a drowsy state. He'll not be irritable anymore. He'll not be anxious anymore. He'll not express his anxiety. He may be anxious, but he'll not be in a position to express his anxiety. And what happens is his awareness gets decreased. He'll become very drowsy, very comatose. And frankly, sometimes he may go in for a coma, and it can become fatal. Right? Why I said this? You'll get this answer right now. Yeah. So the early respiratory acidosis is the epicarc state, whereas the later stage is the antimetard stage. Like, go back to your Metria Medica, just read the drowsiness of antimetard. I think I remember that Dr. Subrato Banerjee, he talks about the difference between ipecac and antimetard. He says one major difference between ipecac and antimetard is the drowsiness. In ipecac, you will not feel any, you will not see any drowsiness, whereas antimetard, you will see drowsiness. Fine. We may take it as a symptom, but if we just go deep into it, like we see that no drowsiness in ipecac is nothing but it states that he's still in the early stage of respiratory acidosis, where he has the energy to respond. Whereas later on, in an antimetard stage, he'll go in for a drowsiness. Like we learn, ipecac doesn't have any drowsiness, antimetard has drowsiness. So that is the difference between antimetard and ipecac. But if we understand it clinically, we can even say that ipecac is a very good medicine for respiratory acidosis, early part of it, whereas antimetard can be a very good medicine for respiratory acidosis in the later part of it. Fine. I'll not say only antimetard or only ipecac will be enough for it. They may need supportive measures like an oxygenation and other supportive measures, but ipecac can do a great work in relieving that particular pathological stage. It helps the body to mount an appropriate response in the particular stage so that this stage can be relieved. Fine. Ipecac and antimetard are not simple asthmatic medicines. What we use in our clinic, it can go very well ahead. It can be a very, very important medicine in an ICU setup also. Only if we understand the real pathophysiology of antimetard or ipecac, we'll be in a position to make other healthcare providers of other systems to appreciate the pathophysiological state and action of our medicines so that some trials can be given of this medicine in ICU setups or a severely deranged person. It may be of a greater help. Like nowadays, we use ipecac and antimetard for a very good measure in our clinics, but that is a very small portion of its real usage. The real usage can be well beyond our clinics, And it's our duty to propagate the real pathophysiological usage of ipecac and antimtar. Fine. That's why, like, actually, when you say ipecac and antimtar are very closely running medicines, but there's a small difference. Both has hypoxia and hypercapnia, and both are very important respiratory associated medicine, but there's a slight difference. Like when you say, like, there's a slight individuality of ipecac and the individuality of antimtar, right? When you say ipecac starts with type 2 respiratory failure, fine. You must know what is a type 2 respiratory failure and what is a type 1 respiratory failure. So, oxygen comes through our nose, or the air is or inhaled through our nose, goes through the nasopharynx, oropharynx, larynx, trachea, comes into the bronchi, bronchioles, terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles. At last, it reaches the alveoli. And alveoli and pulmonary capillaries form something called a respiratory membrane. You have three layers for the oxygen to cross: alveolar epithelium, the basement membrane, and the endothelium of pulmonary capillaries. They are very closely arranged. So when oxygen passes through the epithelium of alveoli, basement membrane, and endothelium, it reaches the pulmonary capillaries where it is used for the circulation. Similarly, carbon dioxide from the pulmonary capillaries crosses all these three layers, comes to the alveoli, and through expiration it's expelled out. Fine. This is how your oxygen comes and gets into a gaseous exchange. If at all there is a problem for the air to reach the alveoli, it can be a problem in the pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, respiratory bronchial, tertiary bronchioles, till the point it reaches alveoli. If at all there is any problem anywhere and air is not able to travel inside into the alveoli, you still will have hypoxia and hypercapnia, because air is not able to enter into the alveoli so that it can go in for exchange. Similarly, carbon dioxide, even if it exchanges into the alveoli, it can't be expelled. So this is called a type 2 respiratory failure. And what do you mean by type 1 respiratory failure? Type 1 respiratory failure, there is no problem with the air coming from external atmosphere through the nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi into the alveoli, but there is a problem in exchange. From the alveoli, there is a problem in exchanging the air, oxygen into the pulmonary capillaries, and similarly, problem in capillaries coming from the pulmonary capillaries getting exchanged into the alveoli. It can be some problem with the respiratory membrane, as we all saw earlier in some other webinar. Like whenever the respiratory membrane, usually the respiratory membrane thickness is somewhere around 0.5 to 1 micrometer. If it increases in the size, like be it any inflammation, where whenever there is an inflammation, you get some exudation, some fluid is expelled out or exudated, and that exudation, if it collects somewhere in the respiratory membrane between the alveolar epithelium and pulmonary endothelium, the respiratory membrane becomes thickened. It will become somewhere around 2 millimeters or even more than 2 micrometers. So if it is going beyond 2 micrometers, oxygen has a very tough time to cross from alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries, and similarly carbon dioxide from the other side to alveoli. So it has to do a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time, so that the amount of oxygen in the blood comes down, and similarly carbon dioxide in the blood increases. So this is your type 1 respiratory failure. And you see, Ipecac is a very good medicine for type 2 respiratory failure. Fine, it starts with a type 2 respiratory failure, because Ipecac is a very good medicine for chronic bronchitis or emphysema or acute asthma or a bronchiolitis or bronchitis also. When these things happen, because of too much of a mucus secretion and too much of inflammatory exudate, the airway becomes very narrowed down, and the airway has a tough time to breathe in air actually. So the amount of air reaching the alveoli is very less. So, and this is actually a type 2 respiratory failure. Problem is that this type 2 respiratory failure, after some time, this can progress into a type 1 respiratory failure. Until that, primarily it is a type 1 respiratory failure. There is a problem in the respiratory membrane, be it a pneumonia or ARDS or a pulmonary edema, anything. The respiratory membrane is thickened, it's swollen. It's very difficult for the oxygen to exchange into the pulmonary capillaries. And there also you have a hypoxia. But the difference between type 1 and type 2 respiratory failure is that in type 1 respiratory failure, hypoxia will be there, but not much of hypercapnia because body is able to breathe out. So how much of a little amount of carbon dioxide is entering into the alveoli, that is immediately expelled. There's an increased respiratory rate, it is expelled. So in type 1 respiratory failure, you'll have hypoxia, but carbon dioxide will be near normal. It will be somewhere between 35 and 45. Whereas type 2 respiratory failure, it is not able to inhale or exhale. So oxygen will be less, carbon dioxide will be high. So if you go even beyond it, when you do a blood gas analysis, for an ipecac, you can initially see a low oxygen count, sorry, hypoxia or a low PO2 and a increased PCO2. Whereas antiMTAD is primarily a type 1 respiratory failure. Later on, you can even have a type 2 respiratory failure. So it has more of an hypoxia with near normal carbon dioxide. Fine. So if you can appreciate, like, I think you all appreciate like where we exactly use ipecac and antiMTAD. AntiMTAD is not simply to be used for any asthma. If you see, Calicarb also is a very good medicine for bronchial asthma or bronchitis. But then you don't see this much amount of hypoxia or hypercapnia. It doesn't disturb a lot of gases exchange. So you can understand, like, fine, that person will also have a lot of breathing difficulty, but not much of a hypoxia or hypercapnia. So your Calicarb is in a different pathological state, whereas antiMTAD and ipecac are in a different pathological state. I think you'll understand and appreciate this one. Next slide, please. So now we'll just see some of the pathological states where ipecac can be of a great use. Next slide, please. So bronchiolitis. Fine. Why is it bronchiolitis? Bronchiolitis, it happens in children less than 2 years, and some books say it is less than 1 year. So any person, any child who is having a lot of severe breathing difficulty, which is airway in origin, must be thought as a bronchiolitis. It has not been asthma. Only after 2 years we can see it as an asthma. Less than 2 years it was said as a bronchiolitis. Bronchiolitis, it is an infection and inflammation of the terminal part of the respiratory bronchial, just above the alveoli. And we all know that our respiratory tract has lots of virus and lot of bacteria as a normal commensal in them. So the respiratory tract usually has certain immune response or immune activity against these viruses and bacteria. So it can easily ward off certain infections. But this terminal bronchiole, the respiratory bronchial part of it, especially in children, they are sterile. They don't have any virus or bacteria in them, at least for the first 1 or 2 years. After that, even they will be having a lot of commensals. In adults, they have a lot of commensals, and adults don't have a lot of bronchiolitis. So because these parts are sterile, they don't have a lot of immune response ability in them built up. So whenever you get a particular type of virus called a respiratory syncytial virus. So this respiratory syncytial virus is somewhat similar to the COVID virus, what we are seeing now. It presents with upper respiratory symptoms for 1 or 2 days, like a sneezing or a runny nose or a throat irritation. And after 2-3 days, they'll present with severe dyspnea because this virus travels from the upper respiratory, goes into the lower respiratory tract. In a child, if it goes into the respiratory, bronchioles or the terminal bronchioles, which doesn't have any mechanism to fight it, it will be severely infected and inflammation will set in. And when there is an acute inflammatory response, there's a lot of mucus secreted, a lot of inflammatory exudate happens. You can see the left side is the normal bronchial tube, the lumen. You can appreciate the right one is the bronchiolitis. You'll see how much narrow is the bronchial tube. So because it's so narrow, air cannot enter easily from the upper and the lower larger airway, the bronchus, into the alveoli. It will be a very difficult task to stretch the bronchial and go inside. So air cannot enter easily inside. Similarly, air cannot be expelled easily outside. It leads to a lot of hypoxia, to a stage where this person can go in for a cyanosis. The child can go in for a cyanosis, blue lips. And if you can see, Ipecac has a lot of these symptoms. The child has a lot of cyanotic episodes. And if you say, like in this bronchiolitis, the alveoli, the right side, some alveoli are hyperinflated because carbon dioxide is not expelled out, or the air is not expelled out. And some alveoli, you can see they are collapsed because air is not able to enter into them. So in bronchiolitis, you can see either hyperinflated alveoli or a collapsed alveoli. And why I say a lot about this bronchiolitis? Bronchiolitis is a very serious issue that happens in children less than 2 years. And more importantly, you don't have any treatment for them. There are three categories: a mild, moderate, and a severe. And the only treatment that is possible is only giving supportive oxygenation. Because being a respiratory viral disease, you will not have any recently given antibiotic or any bronchodilators. Bronchodilators will not help much in this case because it's not a spasm alone. It is a lot of inflammatory exudate and mucus secretion. So bronchodilators may not help a lot. So this mild category, moderate and severe, usually it lasts somewhere around 1 to 2 weeks. So mild category, they don't give any treatment. They'll just observe symptomatically, they'll treat. Whereas a moderate will be given a low flow oxygen and they will be uh, observed, that's all. Maybe if it is very severe, where the person is going for respiratory acidosis or respiratory failure, they may go in for a high flow oxygenation or a ventilator support or a CPAP until the person improves. No amount of antibiotics or any bronchodilators or steroid medication will help in these bronchiolitis patients. Why I say is that, like, if we understand the usage of Ipecac in this bronchiolitis, if bronchiolitis are properly treated in this particular, I'll not say all bronchiolitis, if they fall into the purview of Ipecac pathophysiology, Ipecac can prove a lot useful in this, because Ipecac, if it is given, it will ensure the body mounts an appropriate host response. Inflammation will get settled faster. It will not suppress the inflammation. Inflammation will get over faster. If inflammation gets over faster, mucus secretion will come back to normalcy. You will not have a lot of exudate. Slowly, the narrow being lumen will become the normal lumen, and the recovery period will not be 1 to 2 weeks. It can be shortened within few days. That happens if we really understand the pathophysiology of Ipecac. That's why I said, like, because bronchiolitis is a very serious condition of the infants or the uh, children. And if we are able to help these pediatric cases, and really homeopathic medicines will have a very long way to go. Next slide, please. Fine. About bronchial asthma. I said bronchiolitis, we can call it if it is less than 2 years. If it is crossing more than 2 years. A child of 3 or 4 or 5, 6, 7 years, we will not call it as a bronchiolitis. We'll mostly call it as a bronchial asthma, because respiratory syncytial virus may not evoke a lot of infection in this age, because we will have a lot of immune response mechanism in this age, so they can easily fight it over. But bronchial asthma they are hypersensitive or a hyper irritated stage. It is a chronic inflammatory stage with acute exacerbations. So in this acute state, like they'll have chronic inflammation, a chronic exudation, a chronic smooth muscle contraction. And whenever there is a acute exacerbation of this bronchial asthma, you know that people have for atopic asthma, means they have a family history of allergies. It may be a dermatological allergies, respiratory allergies, or a GAT allergy. Somewhere in the family, someone is having a allergy, and they are born with an atopic state. Means they are born with an allergy hypersensitive stage, and they can easily catch up with bronchial asthma, and they'll become very severe, because some people will not have this atopic state. No one will have an allergic state in their family, and they acquire this bronchial hyper sensitive state, and they'll have these symptoms later in their life, not very early in their childhood, somewhere around 5 years, 7 years, 8 years, gradually over the period. But atopic asthma comes somewhere around 3 years, 2.5 years, somewhere. And atopic asthma is very difficult to treat. It takes lifelong measure to control it, whereas non-atopic asthma, it gets better by the age of 10, 15 years. It's easy to manage. So this atopic asthma, normally they have a chronic inflammation that is going on. And if you can see, the left corner is a normal lumen. The middle one is the uh, asthmatic person who is not in an acute state. Even if they are not in an acute state, you can see the mucosa is thickened, lumen is narrowed down, the smooth muscles, the walls are also a bit disturbed. But the smooth muscles are not contracted like in an acute state, they are relaxed. But the lumen is still narrowed down. But in an acute state, you can see like even the smooth muscles become tightened, more amount of inflammation, more narrowing of the lumen, and you get a severe symptom. And this is a period where they can easily go in for like, if the person is an asthmatic patient, normally getting some slight disturbance, it's okay. But if they are going to an acute exacerbation, there is an acute state, and very little time will be there for compensation, and they can easily go in for respiratory acidosis, and they can present with symptoms like an ipecac, like continuous vomiting, along with the other normal symptoms like your cough under an expectoration, difficult expectoration, and dyspnea, everything will be there. But the striking symptom of uh, increased nausea, not better by vomiting, will always be there. And along with that, you'll have the early signs of respiratory acidosis, that they'll be irritable, they'll be very anxious, they'll be restless, but they'll be very alert. Fine. If this acute asthma is not treated in this stage, if it is going to be alert for some more time, even the respiratory membrane will be inflamed, and there will be exudation there, and it will become thickened, and ripened respiratory failure also sets in, and you'll have an advanced stage of respiratory failure where antimptot type of pathophysiology strikes in. They'll become more drowsy. They'll not be irritable. They'll be more drowsy. They'll still vomit. They'll always sleep. There's a lot of sleepiness. That's what the random tart symptom says. There's a continuous sleepiness. This continuous sleepiness is mainly because of this uncompensated extreme respiratory acidosis. Fine. The next slide, please. Sorry, there was a small disturbance in the net connectivity. Fine. Like your bronchiolitis, like your acute asthmatic episode, chronic bronchitis. Chronic bronchitis, it is also an irritating, like any environmental pollution or irritation, which irritates the mucous membrane for a long time. Like any industrial pollutions like silicosis, pneumoconiosis, or asbestosis, or even as cigarette smoking, where nicotine constantly irritates the respiratory epithelium. What happens is that in the submucosa part of the epithelium, you have an epithelium, a submucosa, where it has a lot of mucus secreting glands. These mucus secreting glands will secrete a lot of mucus. It is also an adaptive mechanism to reduce the irritation in the epithelium. So it tries to secrete a lot of mucus so that it can catch off the irritants, and the irritation can be stopped. The problem is that because of this continuous and too much of mucus secretion, the mucus secretion will become very thickened, and actually it forms like a mucus plug, which will be very thick, and it will block the airway. It will be like a more of a plug. It will block the airway. Air entering and exiting, it will be very, very difficult. Like there can be spasm and narrowing of lumen. But in case of chronic bronchitis, more than the spasm, it is a number of mucus secreting glands which secretes a lot of mucus. And because of the mucus itself, a mucus plug is formed. It's like an atherosclerotic blood vessel. It is so narrowed down. So air doesn't have any chance of entry or exit. And this chronic bronchitis can present with a compensated respiratory acidosis. The PCO2 always will be somewhere around 80, 85. PCO2 somewhere near 45. But their pH will be compensated somewhere between 7.35 and 7.45 because kidneys will take up the charge of reducing the amount of bicarbonate going into the urine. So that you'll see bicarbonate ion also increased. So there will be a compensated respiratory acidosis. They will not much of a symptom. But suppose this chronic bronchitis, suddenly they get an acute infection or a acute exacerbation of this chronic bronchitis. They'll go in for a severe, even more narrowing of it, more narrowing than what they had. And when this narrowing happens, there is a sudden hypoxia and sudden hypercapnia, and body doesn't have any time to compensate now, and they can go in for respiratory acidosis. Again, here also Ipecac will be of great help. Next slide, please. Because why I say all this? Like actually, I can just say this is the state and go, but we must know where all we can encounter such kind of pathological states. Even in emphysema, you'll know emphysema is a state similar to chronic bronchitis because of constant irritation in environmental pollutions like civil smoking or pneumoconiosis, silicosis, or asbestosis, whatever everything. Constant irritation. The difference between emphysema and chronic bronchitis is that in chronic bronchitis, body tries to compensate the irritation by producing more amount of mucus. But emphysema is even more advanced. Body produces a lot of proteolytic enzymes. Instead of helping us, these proteolytic enzymes, they actually digest off all these elastic membranes in our alveoli. What happens is that you will see alveoli small pockets in a big bag. But because of emphysema, all these proteolytic enzymes disturbs all the walls between two alveoli and makes the alveoli as a big bag. Fine. To say actually a big bag can hold a lot of oxygen. And you'll say it's not a problem. You have a very good bag. So you have a lot of oxygen. But thing is that actually the surface area actually comes down. Only if you have small alveoli with separations in between, you increase the surface area and more oxygenation exchange can happen. But in emphysema, because of the loss of interalveolar wall and the whole alveoli becoming on single bag, though in size it may look big, functionally it is not so useful. There is a severe reduction in surface area of gaseous exchange, and they'll be in a chronic hypoxia and hypercapnia. And here also being a chronic diseased condition, our body gets a lot of time to compensate it through kidneys, and they'll be having a compensated respiratory acidosis. They'll not throw much of a symptom, no much of an acute symptom of like a nausea or a continuous vomiting. But even this emphysema, if they get an acute infection or an acute allergic episode, when they go in for a sudden hypoxia and hypercapnia, body doesn't have any much of time to compensate. They again go in for a stage like a respiratory acidosis, which can be thought of an Ipecac pathological state. Fine. So Ipecac goes in for a lot of conditions, starting from a bronchiolitis and acute asthma, or a bronchitis, or a chronic bronchitis, or emphysema. So you can see Ipecac state in many of the respiratory conditions. It can be of great use even in certain pneumonia type of an affections too, but primarily in a airway disorder, more than a parenchymal disorder. Whereas antimptot has more of a parenchymal involvement too, because it affects the alveoli also. So you can see the airway as a pictorial representation of the normal alveoli, bronchitis, and the emphysema. Fine, it's only for your understanding. Fine, we'll go to the next slide, please. Right, this is about your EPICAC. I think you have got a little bit of idea about EPICAC, and I'll be happy if you can give your feedback about the EPICAC pathological state explanation also. Next, we'll go to something called an abrutana. Fine. When I first really understood the real pathophysiology of abrutana, I was shocked. Because all these days I was not knowing about the real use of abrutana. From the days of college, we remember abrotanum is a very good medicine for marasmus. And have used abrotanum for people who are looking marasmus. They are looking or that who are loss of flesh, who are looking like they are having marasmus. But later on, I understood it's not for the marasmus part of it. Like the next slide, please. But you know, marasmus happens in our body when there is a total energy deficiency. In a child who is not having any food, carbohydrate, protein, or fat. If the all three components of the nutrition is not given in a normal quantity, they have a chronic deficiency of carbohydrate intake, protein intake, and fat intake. The body will go into something called a marasmus state. Whereas kwashiorkor is a state where the person will have total energy will be okay. They have enough of carbohydrates or enough of lipids, but their protein intake is decreased to a great level on a chronic basis. They'll go in for a kwashiorkor. Fine. I'll not dwell deep into that. I'll take only on the marasmus. So in marasmus, what happens is that our body understands that this is a long going issue where I may not get a good amount of energy in the near future. I may not get carbohydrates, proteins, or fats. Totally, I'll not have energy at all. So, in order to survive, in order to give a chance of me surviving for a long time, I need to reduce my basal metabolic rate. Meaning, I'll consume less of energy. Energy intake is less, so I'll use less of energy so that I can survive for some more time till the food reaches me. So, in that context, all the organs in the marasmus child will be shrunken. Your heart will be shrunken. The liver will be shrunken. All the muscles, all the organs will go in for an atrophic change. They'll be having a shrinkage. So marasmus exactly means atrophy. So a marasmus child goes in for an atrophy generalized. So this is what is marasmus. But what we learn in marasmus in abrotanum. The previous slide, please. Previous. Abrotanum's first slide. Like if we can clearly see in all the materia medica, it is not given marasmus. Marasmus of lower extremities only. If it is going to be a nutritional marasmus, it is be a marasmus which is generalized. If it is a marasmus of lower extremities alone, only, it is very clearly given. The first line of Boric says it clearly, marasmus of lower extremities only. But in my reading, I really didn't understand this first line, or I just overlooked the part only. And I was more concentrating on marasmus. I really missed the real picture of it for many years. And only later on, I could sense I had made some errors. And when I read it properly, now I could relate to a proper pathophysiology. It's a marasmus of lower extremities alone. Fine. We just now saw that marasmus means in a marasmus state, our body tries to reduce its or that energy usage and goes in for an atrophy of that organ. So marasmus here in abrotonum actually means atrophy. So marasmus of lower extremities only. So what can atrophy in a lower extremity? We don't have any other organs apart from your bones, muscles, and certain other ligaments. So atrophy can happen mainly in the muscle. So what they have said in abrotonum is the marasmus of lower extremities only which can ascend, which usually ascends. So there is a atrophy of the lower respiratory or the muscles of the lower extremities which ascends. So if you need to understand this, why muscles of lower extremities goes in for a sudden atrophy. If it is going to be a nutritional cause, it must be all over the body. If it is going to be only in the lower extremities, which can ascend, it will not be nutrition. It can be either muscular or neurological. More so, a neurological disorder. Fine. Next slide, please. Fine. A neurological disease. You have read something called an upper motor lesion or the corticospinal tract, the tract which starts from the cerebral cortex, which gives the motor impulse. From the cerebral cortex, it goes and reaches the spinal cord. That is called the upper motor neuron. Whereas from the spinal cord, one other nerve starts from the spinal cord and goes up to the muscles out of the spinal cord, comes out of the spinal cord. This is called the lower motor neuron. You all understand, like whatever part of the neuron is there inside the central nervous system. There is a brain and spinal cord is called the upper motor neuron. Whichever travels out of the spinal cord is called the lower motor neuron. If at all there is any problem in the nerves, it leads, like if there is any problem in the upper motor neuron, it leads to paralysis. Similarly, any problem in the lower motor neuron, it leads to paralysis. But there is a difference between this paralysis. The upper motor neuron lesion, if there is a problem in the cerebral cortex or the midbrain or the internal capsule, you'll get an upper motor neuron lesion, you'll get a paralysis. One second, ma, one second. Siddharth, Siddharth, Siddharth. I'm sorry, ma. So in the upper motor lesion, you'll have a paralysis, which will be especially shown with a lot of spasticity. Means there will be an increased tone of the muscles where there will be a spasticity. They'll have a typical spastic movement. And here also the muscles will go in for an atrophy, which will be on a longer time, like for 6 months or 8 months, they'll not use this particular muscle and they'll go in for an atrophy, they'll go in for a shrinking of this muscle. Whereas in lower motor lesion, the problem is there in the nerve somewhere between the spinal cord to the muscle part of it, outside the spinal cord. Here also the person will have a paralysis, but this paralysis will not be spastic, it will be flaccid. The tone of the muscle will be so low that they'll be actually dragging their legs. If legs are affected, they'll be dragging their legs. If hands are affected, they'll drag their hand. They can't even lift it. Whereas in spastic paralysis, they can lift with a lot of rigidity. Right? So, and here in lower motor lesion, certain lower motor lesion, they have paralysis and atrophy will be sudden. Not all lower motor lesions. Some lower motor lesions will have a sudden onset of atrophy. Like you'll understand polio. Polio is a disease of the lower motor lesion neuron. It's a lesion of the lower motor neuron, which will have paralysis, a flaccid paralysis with an acute onset of atrophy. Within days, there will be an atrophy. Next slide, please. Fine. One other small explanation. If you want to understand the lower motor neuron, you need to understand the parts of the lower motor neuron. You see, you have a spinal cord which has an outer white matter and inside gray matter. And you have a dorsal root ganglion and a ventral root ganglion. A dorsal means a part which takes care of the sensory part. A ventral horn is where nerves from the cerebral cortex comes and gives us impulse to the spinal cord. So ventral horn is otherwise called as motor horn or the anterior horn. So your lower motor neuron has the following 5 parts. One is your anterior horn cell. The next you can see two nerves, one in blue and one in red starts. One is the sensory part and the other one is the motor part. They are the root of the nerves, a ventral root and a dorsal root, and they join together to form something called a peripheral nerve. The peripheral nerve, both the sensory and the motor part coexist. This is a peripheral nerve, and then you have the neuromuscular junction, the junction between a synapse between the nerve and the muscle, and the last will be muscle. So if there is the lower motor neuron has these five parts: anterior horn cell, a root of the nerve, a peripheral nerve, neuromuscular junction, and the muscle. So they'll have paralysis irrespective of lesion everywhere, anywhere. The problem can be in the muscle, problem can be in the neuromuscular junction, problem can be in the peripheral nerve, in the dorsal or the ventral root, or the problem can be in the anterior horn cell. I'll not go deep down. Any problem in the root level, this is where we'll see in lumbar spondylosis and other degenerative spinal cord disease. The radicals or the nerve which comes out of the spinal cord through the intervertebral foramina are impinged, and you get a radiating pain and you get a burning pain like your typical sciatic pain. So this says like whenever a person presents with a radiating pain or a burning pain along the course of the nerve, it says the root of the nerve is involved. Whereas the peripheral nerve is involved, like in your diabetic nephropathy, sorry, a diabetic neuropathy or a sensory neuropathy due to vitamin B deficiency, B12 deficiency, or a Guillain-Barré syndrome. This peripheral nerve is affected. Peripheral nerve, either the motor or the sensory part can be affected. If the motor part is affected, it leads to weakness, not as a paralysis or a paralytic weakness. Your GB syndrome, Guillain-Barré syndrome, typically affects the motor part of the peripheral nerve. But a sensory part, if it is affected, you will get an abnormal sensation. Even without stimulating it, you get abnormal sensation like a tingling, numbness, a burning sensation. These are typical for a vitamin B deficiency, B12 deficiency, or a diabetic neuropathy. Whereas neuromuscular junction, here it is typical of your myasthenia gravis. Early in the day, the person will be very strong. The muscle will be working with a lot of energy and vigor. But gradually, as the day goes on, muscle becomes very weak, and towards the end of the day, it will be paralytic weakness. Mainly because the problem is that the synaptic lift between the nerve and the muscle. There's a neuromuscular synapse. There's a problem with the synapse. We'll not go deep into that. The last one can be a muscle issue. A muscle issue will be only a local group of muscles. Whereas all this nerve radical, peripheral nerve, neuromuscular junction or a muscle will not have atrophy in it. Person who have problem in the anterior horn cell alone will have an atrophy along with paralysis. It will be a fast, a sudden onset of atrophy and paralysis. Within few days of the paralysis, they'll go for a severe atrophy. That's all. There's no chance of a recovery at all. No chance of recovery of the atrophied muscles. But if the problem is then the nerve radicals, peripheral nerve, neuromuscular junction, muscle, they'll not have a lot of atrophy, and the chance of recovery is highly possible. Whereas if you say like polio, once a person has gotten atrophy, it's atrophy, that's all. You'll not have a way back to get back this muscular volume back again. So that's what it is. Anterior horn cell will have a lot of atrophy with paralysis. Why I say is that Abrutinum also says about marasmus of the lower extremity. Marasmus of the lower extremity alone happens only if there is a problem in the anterior horn cell. So any problem, any disease, any neurological disease which affects the anterior horn cell causes an acute onset of atrophy alongside paralysis. Fine. Next slide, please. So what is the disease of the anterior horn cell? It can be polio, it can be myelitis, a transverse myelitis, any autoimmune disorders affecting the spinal cord, mainly your transverse myelitis and other myelitis. You have your amyotropic lateral sclerosis, Stephen Hawkins issue, yeah. So you'll all understand like how Stephen Hawking suffered. This ALS typically starts with the lower extremities. Here, the anterior horn cell and the spinal cord gets disturbed. Mainly the anterior horn cell gets disturbed, and the part below that, if it is somewhat, if it is the L2, the part behind the L2, below the L2, supplying the lower extremity will go in for an atrophy and a paralysis. Gradually, what happens in ALS, this autoimmune disorder creeps above. From L2, it can go to L1, T12, then it can go to T11, T9. So gradually, the paralysis from the lower part, it will ascend upwards. There will be an atrophic paralysis that is ascending from the lower extremities upwards. And at last, it can reach even the cervical muscles, and cervical muscles can also go in for an atrophy, and the person cannot even hold the head. In abroton, we can see this symptom. The person is unable to hold the head. Like generally, we'll think it is a nutritional disorder. And I have never used abrotonum for any nutritional marasmus, because abrotonum for a nutritional marasmus, because you need only nutrition to make that better. So actually, abrotonum is something different. It says actually about the affection of the anterior horn cell. And in ALS, if you see, it keeps on ascending up to even the neck getting affected till the point where the spinal cord stays. And at last, they go in for respiratory paralysis and death ensues. That is what we saw with Stephen Hawkins. And there are certain other things called a motor neuron disease. They are idiopathic disturbance of the upper or lower motor neuron pathway, and these are called as motor neuron diseases. These, if this affect the anterior horn cell, we get a paralysis and an atrophy, an acute onset of atrophy. Fine. I just wanted to emphasize on this part that abrotonum has a very good action on these things. Like actually, if we can get a very good medicine for Guillain-Barré syndrome or a transverse myelitis or an ALS, I will not say we can cure it. At least if we can delay it, or if we can decrease the severity of these autoimmune disorders, because till now you don't have a very good medicines for controlling these disorders. You have a lot of immunoglobulins to try to reduce, but even now, recently I had a patient of this lower, like that was the time when I was not knowing about abrotonum. That patient, I didn't treat with abrotonum. They had given a lot of immunoglobulins, and right now he is in a ventilator support. It has ascended to a great extent to the respiratory muscles also. That also has gone for an atrophy, and no, it's a type 2 respiratory failure. Body is not able to pump in oxygen into the blood because your intercostal muscles doesn't expand, thorax doesn't expand, lung cannot expand. He's under ventilator support, and they give only immunoglobulins or sometimes a steroid medication, but knowing very well that it may not help. It will not help. This for him, the problem happened within a period of 6 months to 1 year. Had I known about abrotonum, I could have used. I'll not say for sure. Maybe I could have helped him a little bit if he really dig deep and understand even more pathophysiologies of this state, and some other medicines alongside abrotonum which can help in this state. We may be in a better position to treat all these. Like why I chose these two medicines is that these two medicines can help in many clinical conditions for which allopathic medicines still have difficulty in treating. I'll not call them failures. They are trying to treat it. Maybe they have improved in their treatment, but they still have certain difficulties in treating them. And if we can help the allopathic system with our medicines also, ultimately the patient can get better. Like actually, like the real theme of integrated medicine comes here. Like if we can help them plug their holes of treatment somewhere, so that the combined treatment can improve the outcome of the patient's disorder. If that is going to happen, that is a real integrated medicine. For that, we need to understand a lot of pathophysiology primarily, and the pathophysiology of our medicines, and then if we can try to make them understand, maybe sometime down the line, somewhere this may become a reality. But we need to start somewhere, and somehow, somewhere, we'll get a chance somewhere, maybe in the near future or somewhere after some time, but we'll get it for sure. Next slide, please. Right. Uh, Whatever I said, it was not a notion of myself, because this learning of Abrotanam happened when I, by chance, because generally we don't read Abrotanam again and again. I just had this book of Dr. Banja with me, and when I just opened, the first page had Abrotanam in it. And the first part of Banja's lecture says about adaptability. Any medicine, he gives an adaptability for which patients it is adapted. So when he just saw, they suited to cases of suddenly appearing spinal inflammation or to chronic myelitis. This was the first opening statement of Dr. Banja. And it suddenly said, like, there must be something. And when he went, like, he has clearly mentioned it is suited to cases of suddenly acute appearing spinal inflammation and to chronic myelitis. This actually really opened my eyes. And whatever I say was not from my own understanding. I will not take any credit for saying this. Like, it was said a long, long time back. Only thing is that my eyes opened to their what is that, teachings only now. Maybe it was right in front of my eyes. I was just seeing physically, but I was not understanding it. And now, when I slightly tried to understand it, there was a lot of knowledge that was coming along with it. Like, likewise, if we can just open our eyes to many other lines that was given in Alan's keynote. Like, recently, when we were discussing in our clinic, we just took a medicine on Alan's keynote. The first two lines itself gave the full picture about the pathophysiology of the particular medicine. We are trying to discuss on phosphorus. Myself and Dr. Devi, we are discussing on phosphorus. The first two or three lines give the clear pathophysiology of, like, on whom we need to use phosphorus. Similarly, belladonna, the first two lines, it gives a clear indication, like, what are the diseases it can be tried upon. So if we can understand our homeopathic materia medica, like, only thing is that they have given a lot of scientific inputs in them, and only is that if we can slightly extend our learning on a pathophysiological attitude, we can learn a lot. Fine. The next slide, please. Fine. This will be the last slide. Like, in Abrotanam, we'll be seeing certain other things like rheumatism alternating with diarrhea. And if you see the diarrhea, it says a lot of bloody diarrhea, right? Actually, there's a difference between a diarrhea and a dysentery. Whenever there is a loose stool with bloody discharge, a bloody diarrhea is always called as a dysentery, meaning a dysentery comes from the lower or large bowel, not from the small intestine. It is from the large intestine. A diarrhea comes from the small intestine, and mostly, if it is a bloody diarrhea, it is a dysentery, and origin of affection is in the large intestine. And here in Abrotanam, it doesn't say anything about a fever. So lower bowel disorder with dysentery can be bacterial in origin. But if it is a bacillary dysentery, it will come with an acute fever like a belladonna or a mercor. But in Abrotanam, there is no mention about any acute rise of fever, meaning it is not an infection. It must be an inflammation. Two inflammatory conditions in the large intestine are ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. And these two are thought to be an autoimmune disorder. Rheumatism. There is no mention about any modalities or symptoms which will say it is a degenerative joint disorder. It is a rheumatism, meaning it can also be an inflammatory rheumatism, meaning it can also be an autoimmune disorder. So here, the author says rheumatism gets better when the person is having a diarrhea, and whenever diarrhea is checked, rheumatism gets worse. Meaning, rheumatism is a particular autoimmune disorder. When that rheumatism is at its peak, you don't have the other autoimmune disorder or diarrhea. When the rheumatism runs its course, or it is getting better, or it is made better, the other autoimmune disorder in that particular person gets more. It can be a lower bowel disorder, either it can be ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease or any other autoimmune disorder, inflammatory lower bowel disorder that is getting more. Or if a person is having a lower bowel disorder with a bloody dysentery, and there are certain medicines that are given for this autoimmune disorder, they are checked or they are treated. Only that autoimmune part of diarrhea part of dysentery part of it is treated. That autoimmune state is stopped, but somewhere else the autoimmune state is increasing. That is rheumatism. Means that there's a generalized autoimmune disorder with a hyperinflammatory state. So just by checking your or stopping the diarrhea or stopping the rheumatism part of it doesn't cure you of the full autoimmune part of it. You need to do something on a better plane where the whole autoimmune part of it is taken care of. This underlines that abrotanum is a very good medicine for a generalized autoimmune disorder with a hyperinflammatory state, with a particular action on the spinal cord, especially on the anterior horn cell, which can cause atrophy of the muscles of the lower extremities or the marasmus of the lower extremities, which can ascend upwards, meaning that autoimmune disorder doesn't stay with one particular segment of the spinal cord, it moves to the previous segment also. So it is going to spread. It can be seen in Guillain-Barré syndrome, ALS, motor neuron disorders, or even transverse myelitis. So uh, I think it will help you to understand the pathophysiology of abrotanum, and this will help us in decoding the pathophysiology of not only abrotanum and ipecac. It will help us a lot in our clinical setup also, and it will help in us decoding more and more medicines in future. And I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Akshaya Balaji for painstakingly doing this PPT for me. If not for the PPT, I think it will be a very difficult process for me to describe or explain various tenets of this presentation. And I thank Dr. Akshaya for all her efforts. And I thank all the colleagues of mine, all the colleagues in Chennai, all the doctors, can be senior doctors, junior doctors, students, anyone. They have given a lot of discussion, a lot of inputs, and somewhere these inputs have helped me a lot in trying to understand the pathophysiology of certain medications. And I thank wholeheartedly to all my colleagues in practice, especially Dr. Naushin, Dr. Devi, Dr. Veera, Dr. Akshaya, Dr. Vaishnavi. Sorry if I had missed certain names. You have all helped me a lot in understanding many of my experiences. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for the mind-blogging session, sir. Participants are requested to post any queries in the chat box. I repeat, participants, if you have any queries, you can post in the chat box. Our honorable speaker will answer them. So I guess we have got a first question, sir. So this is Dr. Fijala is asking, how can we study pathophysiology of our medicine? Any book reference, sir?
Fine, doctor. Actually, there is no particular medicine which will say about the pathophysiology of our medicine. Actually, it's all scattered. Our learning of physiology, our learning of disease diagnosis, our learning of pathophysiology of many diseases, all these things put together, we'll try to learn our medicine also. Like there is not a particular book which says about the pathophysiology of our medicine, but learning physiology, pathology, and medicine deep down. Nowadays we have a lot of that information going around. We have a very good YouTube channels which will give a lot about the physiology and pathophysiology and of diseases. And alongside, if you can learn our Materia Medica, you take our Materia Medica, take one line as such at a time. If it is going like in Belladonna, it is given like it is a very good medicine for or is it sanguine temperament, or is it they are very active during normal stage, during disease stage they are very irritable and disturbed. Fine. This particular line, if you just take like who will be normal but disturbed during an irritable state, sorry, disease state, like any healthy person who is not having any structural disorder, any child or any otherwise healthy person who is not having any comorbid state, if he is getting a fever, till the point he has got a fever or headache, he'll be lively. But the moment he gets a fever or a headache, gets disturbed or irritated. But the moment the fever and headache goes off, he goes back to a normal state. Yeah, again becomes normal. So belladonna just gives this symptom. But if you just take a symptom and just understand why this was written, we give a lot of psychological interpretations to it, but we'll just keep it very simple. It's not very difficult. Anyone can do this. Just take a line of from your Materia Medica. It can be even a simple, though I say it is simple, it is Trasha House. Alansky note, if you just take a small line, just try to question why that was line. Like just ask why. When you start asking why, you will try to learn a lot. Alongside, you learn a lot of pathology and physiology and medicine. And I'll just say a few, 2 or 3 YouTube channels which has helped a lot. One is Ninja Nerd Medicine. It has helped a lot in understanding pathology. Najib's lectures have helped a lot. Dr. Bean's lectures, osmosis. There are plenty of this one. And Najib and Ninja Nerd Medicine are very important. Only thing is that you need a little bit of patience because each video goes somewhere around 40-45 minutes. And over time, you'll get used to it. Like you'll become more addicted that you'll not spend a day even without seeing one video a day. Yeah. You can answer to the next question, please. Hello. Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. So,
Yeah.
Dr. Sunita has asked, sir, please explain marked drowsiness during fever in anti-tart, in boric repertory, opium and antim-tart given for the symptom.
Yeah, antim-tart not for any fever. Any fever which affects the respiratory membrane when there is a severe hypoxia or any disease which can cause severe hypoxia. A severe bronchiolitis, meaning a bronchiolitis, a severe inflammation of the bronchioles, you have a lot of fever, even it may be pneumonia. Antim-tart is a very good medicine for pneumonia. When in pneumonia, you get a consolidation. There, the alveoli cannot exchange air properly. At the same time, there will be a lot of inflammatory exudate, which will increase the thickness of respiratory membrane. You will not have proper gases exchange. So in cases like bronchiolitis or severe acute pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia, or even some cases of viral pneumonia or any ARDS, when the gases exchange is disturbed, they go in for a severe respiratory acidosis where the hypoxia and hypercapnia. And after stage, usually any increase in carbon dioxide stimulates the medullary center of respiration. But if it is going beyond certain time limit, it will not stimulate, it will depress the respiratory center. And they'll still go for a drowsiness. Drowsiness is a mark of advanced respiratory acidosis. Whereas opium has a very peculiar action. Opium is a medicine which depresses the medullary center of respiration. It doesn't have any direct pathology on the lungs or the respiratory passages. It has a lot of action on the central nervous system. Opioid is a centrally acting medicine. It depresses the medullary center of respiration, and thereby it causes severe hypoxia and drowsiness. And that is also a cause of respiratory acidosis. But there's a difference between antiemtar's respiratory acidosis and opium's respiratory acidosis. Opium directly affects the medullary center of respiration. It depresses that, whereas antiemtar pathologies are in the respiratory membrane and the alveoli. Is it okay, madam?
Thank you, sir. So next question is by Dr. Rekha Karnan. So she has asked, GB syndrome is autoimmune in origin and peripheral neuritis. Does that have any prognostic values?
GB syndrome is autoimmune origin in peripheral neuritis. Fine, like that's all. Like GB syndrome, it is an autoimmune disorder which you can get even after a small episode of diarrhea or a viral infection or anything. Whenever there is an inflamed state in our body can respond in an autoimmune state and cause affection of the peripheral nerve, and mainly the motor part of the peripheral nerve, and it can lead to a paralysis. But things are like certain GB syndrome are self-limiting, or most of the GB symptoms are self-limiting. Only in very less case of GB syndrome, it causes a permanent disability. Maybe 2 months, 3 months, or 4 months down the line, GB syndrome improves. And for GB syndrome, the other system of medicine treats a lot with steroid medications and physiotherapy, and it helps. After a few months, it helps. So GB syndrome, most part of it has a very good prognosis. It doesn't lead to a complete paralysis, only in certain conditions where peripheral nerves of the thorax are affected, intercostal nerves are affected. They can go in for a respiratory issue, or if your phrenic nerve is affected, diaphragm can be affected, which can prove fatal. Otherwise, GB syndrome, if it is affecting the extremities, chance of it getting recovered is very high.
Thank you, sir. So next question is from Dr. Mitra. And she has asked, like, sir, I have read that reflex epilepsy, example, stramonium will get epilepsy from seeing bright light. That's due to retinal irritation causes reflex epilepsy. But how should we interpret these symptoms of increased sensitivity in disease state?
Fine, ma'am. Like you'll appreciate that any epilepsy or any seizures or any convulsions, it is mainly because of the increased sudden neural discharges. Normally, there will be neuronal discharges, which is in a regulated pattern. But for a sudden burst, for a second or so, there will be an uncontrolled increased neuronal discharge of any particular part of the cerebrum, brain, or the complete part of the brain. So it can lead to a localized seizure or a generalized seizure. So the main reason for a seizure or convulsion is an uncontrolled, unexpected, transient neuronal discharge. So this trigger for uncontrolled, unexpected, transient neuronal discharge can come from any quarters. And one important reason for this discharge is your bright, shining objects. So people who are having this tendency for epilepsy or neuronal discharge, sudden transient neuronal discharge, they can have this sudden neuronal discharge even by seeing a bright object, a shining object, because seeing a bright shining object, sometimes for a normal person, it will not stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. But in case of a disturbed person, the sympathetic stimulation can take this bright shining object as a danger sign, and they can go in for a danger mode stimulation. When there is a danger mode stimulation, there will be hyper neuronal discharges, and that person can go in for an epilepsy. Fine. That can be the reason for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. IHMA Chennai chapter conveys its heartfelt thanks to Dr. Anantaraman, sir, National Working Committee member, for joining us today and sharing his phenomenal knowledge on an attempt to understand the pathophysiology of homeopathic Medina Medica. I thank IHMA Chennai chapter for giving me this opportunity, and special thanks to Dr. Akshaya for helping me with this MCs in this webinar. I request Dr. Ashok Kumar, sir, Secretary, IHMA Chennai chapter, to deliver his vote of thanks. Ashok, sir?
Yeah, hello. Am I audible? Yeah. Good evening, doctors. Okay, it's been a great 2 months of a journey for between us, and we had many sessions which were very knowledgeable, and we had a great sharing of thoughts and things. And thanks to our IHMA's Tamil Nadu chapter and all our senior doctors for initiating this program. And but I need to thank my Chennai team for working hard for this 2 months in getting it done, and for all the Sundays, right? We were having a few hours of coordination for this event and making it a good success. Hopefully we will join in other sessions, upcoming sessions, and we have few proposed things like starting our sports event possibly in 2 or 4 months, and also our sessions of this photography and some little bit cultural kind of an activity events also, or proposed plans. So hopefully we will come with the plan and we will execute the dates also with that. And I would like to name our Chennai team members for thanking them. To start up with our Dr. Akshaya, Dr. Bhavnesh, Dr. Sneha, Dr. Shankari, Dr. Mithun, Dr. Swaminathan, Dr. Mohiddin, Dr. Vaishali, Dr. Vinodini, Dr. Naushin, Dr. Abhirami, Dr. Devi, and I guess covered all. Because without their help, right, we would not have done this thing possible. And thanks for the participants for supporting us, and whenever we are making some programs, right, your presence makes us feel more enriched, and that drives us in working hard in future programs also. So please support us the way how you always do for us. And hopefully we will come with the other new kind of sessions, or new innovative kind of sessions. Thank you all, sir. And thank you, special thanks to Anantaraman sir. Thank you, sir. Yes.